That's not a Retina. What's that? Well, it's a close relative. This is a Kodak Duo 6-20 Series 2, and it was made in 1939-1940. It's probably fairly well related to this, which of course is a Kodak Retina 2A Type 150, made at about the same time period. So it'll be interesting to see what similarities I see here. I noticed something straight away. In both cases the top cover has a strap lug screwed into the end of the top cover, and they look to me to be identical parts. The general appearance of the top cover is quite similar. The frame counter mechanism here, that looks quite similar too. The way the top on here is fitted for the adjustment of the rangefinder, that's also much the same, although you could say it was flipped on one camera. But you can see the same basic pattern has been used. A separate plate, fairly thin, screwed at the corners, and the shoe sitting loose in the middle. And the same with the Retina 2A rather. The look of the wind knobs, again, somewhat similar. The pattern here is virtually identical, except this being a larger knob. So, a very close relative. The shutter release differs. On the Retina 2A here, it's not exactly flat on the top of that button, but it's close to it. And on the Duo 6-20, it's much more domed. The base of the cameras, you could say they were similar. There's not that much resemblance there because of the different needs of the rangefinder camera, the roll film camera. So this is a 620 roll film this camera took. There's that front release, there it is on the base. So you release the front with this button on the base. And what have we got? Kodak Anastigmat lens, f3.5, 7.5 centimeters. That's not a coated lens. Coating was pretty much introduced during wartime and it was featured in post-war cameras. So there'll be a little bit of work here, I think, figuring out how everything goes and opening this thing up. It's here for servicing. I think its main complaint is probably the shutter. It usually is. Let's see what that's like on a slow speed. Oh, it's very stiff in its controls. We'll try it in 1 second. No, it doesn't run. So the shutter's certainly gummed up in this example. Our focus adjustment here is here, as a helical adjustment. Our diaphragm pointer or aperture pointer there at the top of the shutter, and the diaphragm does not want to move, does not want to open. So that tells me that that's probably well and truly glued up. I'm just checking to see whether you can you can't close the front of the camera unless the focus is returned to the infinity position. There's an interlock there to stop you closing the front of the camera. So that's somewhat similar to the Retina because that certainly has a feature much like that. The back cover here, they are certainly related. This is a separate plate fixed with small screws. The design of the viewfinder window there is identical. Again, we have the back plate fixed with small screws. So a very close relative to the Retina, and I'm interested to see whether its insides show as much resemblance as the outsides do. So how do we get into this camera? The first thing I want to do with this camera is remove the shutter and lens assembly. I'll service them first and separately because that should be very straightforward for me, and it'll make life much easier if I get that undone. Here I've got the retaining rings coming loose. I'll just use the same sort of retaining ring tool that I would use for doing one of the retinas there. Okay, so there's our shutter and lens assembly. I'll pop the body to one side. Let's have a look at this. We've got a shim ring here, paper shim ring. I want that off, and I'd like to have it off in one piece. It's got an extra hole punched in, which probably means someone's done something cruel to it. Now there's no alignment pin there to position the shutter in the body. Oh, the alignment pin exists in the body itself rather than the shutter. Normally you would have a pin in the shutter and you would have a hole in the body. This one has a pin in the body and a hole in the shutter. That's okay. That's easily done. That explains the extra hole in this shim, because it just means that this was mispositioned when the shutter was fitted back in place. Okay, so that's something a bit interesting. The rear lens group just unscrews. I just used my fingers to get that loose. If it was tight, you might need to use a friction tool. It's a bit grimy looking, but I expect that'll clean up. And the front group. That looks pretty good. And here we have the shutter itself. Well, we know this one's gummed up. It doesn't really do much. It doesn't want to close even on the B setting. So I'll start stripping the shutter down and we'll see if there's anything interesting to spot on the way through. Right, I'll remove the screw from the nameplate. Sometimes the nameplate's a bit springy and it'll want to flick that screw off into outer space. This one wasn't too bad. I'll take the other one off too, just for good measure. We've got our lock screw there. I'll rotate that out of the way. And the front will just bone it onto the shutter. This is quite sticky. Suggests it's a bit greasy, a bit oily perhaps. Could be gummed up with a bit of dust as well. Let's see if I can get that loose. It doesn't want to lift off. I've rotated the bayonet to where it should lift off. I'll just prise lightly under the speed settings cam plate, see if that will lift off completely. Yeah, it's coming. That's very gummy. There shouldn't be too many surprises under here. This should just be a fairly standard looking arrangement. There's nothing unusual to be seen there. Bit sticky perhaps, nothing too bad. Let's have a look at the shutter. Well, we know the blades don't want to run down. I'll unhook the spring from the main lever, which is currently under tension. That's very stiff. Doesn't want to move smoothly around the shutter. These levers would control the B setting in particular. I don't know whether the shutter has T as well, does it? No, just B. That all looks good. The shutter blades certainly open and close. The retard gear train is stuck. That's wedged wedged stuck, suggests there's a problem there. I don't know if anyone's had the shutter apart. Once I got the front off, this was displaced. It wasn't sitting correctly relative to the main lever, but that could easily have happened just as I was lifting the top off, so I don't know. Will the shutter release arm lift off? Yes. Okay, I'll start stripping this down. I'm looking for anything that's unusual, anything that I don't immediately recognise from this style of shutter. I'm not seeing anything that's particularly strange at the moment. That's the catch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. This lever, which is normally, that's our return spring for our shutter release lever. Quite commonly that would have a flash contact there, or a tripod socket. A cable release socket is often fitted in that position. Later shutters would have had a flash contact there. Not this one, of course, because it's pre-war or wartime, depending on where you lived. Remove this screw. This is a shoulder screw that holds this lever in place. This is the B lever. Here's our high-speed spring. That would give us our 500th of a second spring, or something approaching it. And that's probably enough from the front of the shutter. At the back of the shutter, there are 3 screws that hold the shutter case and the mechanism plate together. Now, I already know that the diaphragm is gummed up because the aperture settings lever didn't want to move. Yeah, I can lift off the shutter case. Have a quick look at this. Yeah, the diaphragm is completely glued up. I'd have to force that lever to make that move at all, and chances are we'd break something. Well, we've got the last culprit's fingerprints here and here. I'm not sure we'd be able to track them down at this late stage. Okay, so that's got to be stripped down. That's certainly gummed up completely and the diaphragm wouldn't work. Having a look at these shutter blades, they're a bit marked. I wouldn't say they were particularly oily. No. So they were not the problem with the shutter. Let's have a look at this mechanism plate. Now the blade actuating ring is moving freely enough, so that was also not the problem with the shutter. We can remove some of this overburden. Let's have the lever off for a start. And the retainer here is held with 3 screws in this place. And they're tight. And to take note of which screw goes where. That was a long screw in that position. Well, there'd normally be a long screw in that position. That's a short screw, and I'd expect to find a short screw there. What about this one? That's a short screw, and I'd expect to find a short screw there, so no surprises. Here's the retainer plate, a little bit oily looking perhaps, nothing too dramatic there. Here's our blade actuating ring, a bit dirty, nothing too dramatic. And here's our problem, this speed train. That doesn't want to move. It suggests that it's been put back on the body, it's jammed up for some good reason, or it's been put back on the body in the wrong place. I'll try flushing that with a bit of solvent. We'll see if that's going to free up easily. It may do. Certainly the arm at the end moves freely enough, but there's just no take up here of the gear. That gear's not picking up. It's well and truly jammed up, so that's going to have to come off. Now, I particularly dislike removing these speed trains entirely because they are awkward to get timed again afterwards. In this case we don't really have much choice because it's well and truly jammed up, and we'll need to find out why. I'm just looking at all the gears to see if there's anything jammed in there that may explain why it doesn't want to move. That one moves freely enough. This wheel doesn't. This wheel moves. This wheel and its axle doesn't move. It's seized up for some reason. Most likely corrosion. Its pivot point or bearing, if you like, is here. That may, I don't know whether that's on an axle, whether it's a wheel on an axle, whether it's on a post. It looks like it's riveted in, which means it's sitting on a post. And it looks like it's probably corroded onto that post. Alright. Well, I'm going to give this a good long burst in the ultrasonic cleaner in some naphtha, and hopefully that will rattle free that wheel and its shaft. I don't know how that's sitting on there, but that's certainly our problem, that one there. If I can get that to free up, we'll be in business. Well, that's had 15 minutes in the ultrasonic. Let's see if it's made any difference. Not really seeing any wiggle on that wheel. Definitely not that one. Definitely not that one. It's definitely that one. There is some movement there. There was no movement at all previously. Yeah, it is moving. I think it's going to need more time though to shake that loose. Let's see if I can wind that in with that gear. Oh, it's definitely moving. Right, I think I'm on the right track. That can go back. I think more time in the ultrasonic cleaner. I think it's most likely corrosion. I thought another possibility was that there was some dried up oil in there was jamming that wheel up, but we'll find out. Well, I have that speed train freed up and working quite well. I'm fairly convinced that it was corrosion, that the problem was on that wheel and that wheel obviously rides on a fixed shaft. So the axle is fixed to the body and the wheel rides on that. It's got a hole right down the middle of it, and I think that was our problem. Now it's taken an awful lot of work flushing that backwards and forwards and working it to get that to run free. I think corrosion is the most likely scenario there, just given the general feel of it. When it was partly almost freed up, it felt quite rough, which suggests to me that there was some friction in there, lumpy friction, and lumpy friction is much more likely to be corrosion, lumps and bumps, rather than stickiness from dried oil, which I would expect just a constant drag. So what I'm going to do, which is something I don't normally do, is I'm going to put a drop of watch oil. I've got some Mobius something or other here, 9010, and I'm going to put a drop of that top and bottom on that shaft, and it'll work its way down between the shaft and the wheel, and see how that behaves. I won't know for sure until it's all back in the shutter and we see if it functions correctly, but I'm hopeful. And if of course it all turns to custard, I will simply find another speed train and replace the lot. Well, with no speed train present, of course, I can have better access to clean my mechanism plate. And what I'm doing here is making sure I get rid of any old dried grease and oil and all the dust and rubbish that it accumulates over time. Because that's one thing you can say for grease and oil, it's great for trapping contaminants in place. And what was once a lubricant becomes a grinding paste over time, and just helps wear things out. Right, well that's clean. I'll put the speed train back on there now and see how it goes. You've got to get this put back in the right position so that the spring is neither too tightly wound or too loosely wound, otherwise you won't get the mechanism to run smoothly. I think I've got it positioned correctly there. Of course I'll have to put in a fair bit of time getting the shutter correctly timed once all this is over, because as soon as you disturb the speed train, it's a major effort to get the speeds correct. And generally you don't need to. Generally when you're servicing one of these shutters, you can clean the speed train quite adequately on the mechanism plate, flushing it with naphtha and working the mechanism, blowing out the naphtha and repeating. Why will this not pick up the hole? The other wheels on the speed train are all on axles, so that the pivot, the diameter of the pivot's relatively small, and it's narrow because it's only the width of the thickness of the plate. But the wheel that was causing the problems, that's on a fixed axle, and so the hole down the middle of that wheel is effectively quite large. You know, perhaps half a dozen times as much. So there's quite a bit more surface area involved there. This seems to move smoothly enough here on the plate. So I'm fairly hopeful that this will be a success. Oh, I see I forgot to put the spring post on at this end of the speed train. I knew there was something not quite right. So I'll get that in place. That's where the spring for the main lever connects. Yeah, that works just like I bought one at the moment. I'll pop the blade actuating ring back in place. And its retainer. The retainer has a rivet on it that only fits in one position. The rivet fits down into a locating hole in the plate. And of course we had 3 screws that held this down. And I remember which one went where. There's 2 of them are the same, 2 of them are short. Went there and there. And the longest screw went over here. That moves freely. I'll put the lever on the other side, and the lever will lubricate that with a very light wipe through the pivot and the slot where it activates the blade actuating ring, and put that in place. I'll check that action. That seems to be free enough. I'll put its spring in position. Seems to be snappy in its action. And the blade actuating ring here I will lubricate with a bit of graphite powder. And I'll do that simply by dropping a little bit of graphite powder in around the blade actuating ring. And working it backwards and forwards. Graphite powder has an advantage over oils and greases in that it doesn't get sticky over time. It will not attract dust. And really it doesn't make much difference what temperature it's at, probably. It doesn't ever get viscous. Okay, I'll go and blow that excess powder out.